Dr. Angela Muir is Associate Professor in British Social and Cultural History and the Director of the Centre for Regional and Local History at the University of Leicester. And she's going to be speaking to us this evening on forced abortion in England and Wales in the long 18th century. So we really welcome her to the seminar. Angela, over to you.
Thanks, Margot. Okay, so in September 1731, a 26-year-old woman named Anne Hale made a complaint before two Flintshire magistrates. Her grievance was about a series of interactions she had had with a young woman named Jane Jones the year prior. In August 1730, that one, I'll just go through something like that. In August 1730, Jane had been brought by her father to live near Anne in St. Asaph, where she was placed with a proctor who was John Williams and his wife. According to Anne, one Tuesday that August, she came to Jane and told her she was pregnant by her father's husbandman. When Jane's father found out, he took her into the cellar and beat her black and blue. He also insisted Jane marry a man of his choosing, which was not the father of her child, who was apparently willing, and who Jane preferred to marry over the man her father had selected. Jane's father then took the still pregnant Jane to live with the Williams. The next day, which was a Wednesday, Jane came to Anne again and told her that Mr. and Mrs. Williams had plans to give her something that would cause her to miscarry, which Anne advised Jane not to take. Then on the Thursday, Mrs. Williams came to Anne and asked her to come and see her cousin Jenny, who was busy groaning. And this would suggest that Jane may have been experiencing pains associated with labor or miscarriage. But at this point in the narrative, it doesn't appear that Jane had actually consumed any abortifacient substances yet at all. So it could be that Mrs. Williams was referring to complaints or protestations Jane was making. When Anne went over, Jane told her that her father and Mr. Williams had gone to Holywell to fetch something to make her miscarry. The next day, which was the Friday, Jane again went to see Anne and told her that Mrs. Williams had brought her something as promised the previous night, but instead of taking it, she put it in the chamber pot. That morning, Mrs. Williams asked how her physic had worked and whether she had been griped, likely referring to the desired gastrointestinal symptoms that would have been caused by whatever she had given Jane. The belief was that, and I quote, violent evacuations of the bowels were risky for pregnant women because they could cause a miscarriage. And this is discussed in several medical texts from the time. However, Jane replied that she felt perfectly fine. And this led Mrs. Williams to demand to know if Jane had actually taken the stuff at all. Jane insisted she had, but Mrs. Williams evidently doubted her. Jane went to Anne's that day to beg to lodge there because she feared that she would be forced to consume whatever the substance was. And Anne said she was welcome to stay as long as she liked. However, a short time later, the Williams servant came and escorted Jane back. Finally, on the Saturday afternoon, Mrs. Williams came to Anne and asked her to put the kettle on so that tea could be made for Jane, who was very ill and had them, which is underlined in the text, sadly upon her. Them was presumably a euphemism for menstruation, which she was trying to pass off or pass a miscarriage off as. Jane arrived shortly after with her hands on her belly, stooping and seemingly in a lot of pain. Once alone, Jane told Anne that Mrs. Williams had forced her to take 3 spoonfuls of a substance that she described as being black and thick as treacle, and then she was sent to bed. She later woke up during the night in severe pain, charging the Williams with having poisoned her. It's not clear what the Williams actually gave Jane, but given her symptoms, it was possibly some sort of herbal medicine such as savin diluted in treacle and not something more sinister such as arsenic. Jane told Anne she spent the night pacing about her room in increasing pain until she finally miscarried into her chamber pot and was then given some brandy. Anne told Jane that she didn't believe her, which led Jane to lift up her clothes to reveal her indecent and bloody condition, and to tell Anne that if she wanted further proof, she could look in the chamber pot. Anne declined. Jane went on to say that she hoped the sin of it would not fall on her, but on Mrs. Williams and her children. And perhaps in an effort to come to terms with what had been done to her, Jane also told Anne that because her child had been conceived in sin, she believed it would have been born in sin had Mrs. Williams not forced her to miscarry. Immediately after her miscarriage, Mrs. Williams wrote to Jane's father to say that the business was done and that he could come with the man who wanted Jane to marry. 2 days later, Jane came to Anne to say that she had milk in her breasts, which she then showed Anne. And this is the first hint we have at how far along Jane may have been when she was forced to miscarry. So she was probably at least 4 months pregnant and may have even been further along. In the same visit, Jane told Anne that she was to be married the following week. And this surprised Anne, who asked Jane how she could think of marrying so soon, saying that no man could be foolish enough to not know how it was with her. But not long after this, Jane was married. The day after her wedding, she returned to Anne and said she had managed her husband quite well because she had followed Mrs. Williams' advice for the first time her husband enjoyed her. She told Jane to clasp her legs together and squeak and squeal, which she had done. And because, as Jane said, she had married a fool, it worked because he was none the wiser. This deposition is a useful starting point because it carries several common hallmarks of similar cases of what can be referred to as forced abortion from the long 18th century. These are instances where women's bodies were acted upon through some sort of violence or coercion with a specific aim of forcing them to miscarry. This case is typical because it involves a young, unmarried woman who ended up pregnant by someone who she was prevented from marrying. She was then compelled to consume some sort of toxic substance, apparently against her will, with the aim of inducing an abortion, which in this case appears to have been successful. However, Jane's story is unique for at least 3 reasons. First, Jane survived. As we'll see, this was not always the case. The second reason is that the father of Jane's unborn child was said to be willing to marry her, and it was Jane's own father that prevented it. And this is the only case that I'll be discussing today where this was a feature. The third reason is because Jane was the one who was accused. The specific charge against her was for taking an abortifacient to effect an abortion or miscarriage. The case was presented to the Court of Great Sessions, which was the highest criminal court in Wales prior to the 1830s, similar to the English Assizes or the Old Bailey. However, the grand jury did not formally indict her, so she did not stand trial. In most of the cases that ended up in court, at least prior to the 19th century, the person charged was the father of the unborn child. Also prior to the 19th century, most charges were not for administering something to induce an abortion, but for the murder or attempted murder of the pregnant woman. Although abortion was seen as a grave sin under English common law, using poisons to induce an abortion was not a serious felony and was rarely tried, at least prior to the 19th century. So the fact that an attempt was made to have Jane tried also makes it stand out. So what I'm going to do in this paper is explore a range of narratives relating to apparent forced abortions in England and Wales between the late 17th and early 19th centuries, roughly between 1680 and 1830. These are instances where women's pregnant bodies were acted upon through some sort of violence or coercion with the aim of terminating pregnancy. Many of these cases were so violent they resulted in the death of the pregnant woman, which is why they ended up in the historical record. I say apparent forced abortions because one of the arguments I'm going to be proposing here is that in many of these cases that appear at first glance to have been harm done in the course of procuring an abortion through force or coercion, upon closer look, were conscious attempts to end the pregnant woman's life, not just the fetus. I'll mainly be drawing upon pretrial evidence I've collected from the Welsh Court of Great Sessions, the English Assizes, and to a lesser extent, proceedings from the Old Bailey. I'm also considering cases reported in newspapers, some of which I also have the criminal records for, but not all of them. I'll then spend very little time at the end considering these examples alongside murdered sweetheart ballads, which share many similar themes with these cases, and for me, help cast further doubt on whether we should be thinking about some of these in terms of forced abortion or as homicide, or more specifically, femicide. In exploring these cases, I want to draw our attention to particular types of very closely related violence against women, namely reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence. Many historians, including myself, have discussed cases where women were compelled to ingest abortifacient medicines or poisons in the context of illegitimacy and infanticide, which is completely reasonable. So in terms of the desperate measures some people would take when faced with an unwanted pregnancy or birth. What I want to do here is go a bit further. Unwanted and unplanned pregnancies were key motives for these acts of violence, but as we'll see, the levels and patterns of violence and coercion involved in many cases allow us to consider these contexts or consider contexts beyond illegitimacy and infanticide. So my aim here is to explore what these crimes reveal about women's experiences of men's violence in the past, both in terms of the violence that ended these pregnancies and the relationships that led up to these acts of violence. By comparing real and fictional cases from the long 18th century and drawing on modern social science research into forced abortion, I'll examine how these cases reflect patterns of reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence. Now, forced abortion is a topic I've been wanting to explore for some time after coming across various cases while researching illegitimacy in 18th century Wales over the past 10 plus years. I initially began thinking about these in terms of how forced abortion is the opposite side of the abortion debate coin that we don't necessarily think about. In a world where safe and effective abortion options exist, anti-abortionists attempt to restrict women's rights to choose to terminate pregnancy. In the past, when safe and effective abortions were not readily available, cases like these demonstrate efforts to remove women's right to choose to carry a fetus to term. However, what I did not appreciate to begin with is that this idea is something that's already been adopted by some anti-abortion activists in the US. So the idea that if we allow abortion to exist, women will be forced into it. And that's not an ideology I want to align with. So the other reason I've shifted away from that initial idea is because what I found in the record suggests that thinking about these only in terms of abortions directs our attention away from what I think is the broader context of this violence and who much of this violence was actually targeting. So just a quick note on sources, which I'm happy to say more about afterwards if anyone's interested. This research draws mainly on 24 cases from the Court of Great Sessions in Wales, the Northern and Western circuits of the English Assizes, the proceedings of the Old Bailey Online, and two different newspaper databases, the British Library Newspaper Archive and Welsh newspapers. 24 is a relatively small sample, but this is a work in progress. And these were also crimes with very specific circumstances that mean fewer than you might expect ended up in the historical record. For these cases to end up in court, a pregnant woman needed to be assaulted or poisoned because of her pregnancy. If no one found out about this violence, or if the link between the violence and her pregnancy wasn't made, or if a woman was not able or chose not to share her story of what had been done to her, it was unlikely that any charges would be made. For someone to prosecute on her behalf, a pregnancy needed to be known about, at least by those closest to her. The relationship between the accused and the victim had to be such that the pregnant woman's illness, injury, or death would raise suspicions. And her symptoms also had to be sufficiently suspicious to connect them with the context of her pregnancy. So there were undoubtedly many, many other instances that could be considered here, but have left no obvious trace. So based on this, 24 is a reasonably good sample. And I'll also briefly consider some of these in relation to about a half dozen murder ballads. I'm specifically interested here in cases where a woman's pregnancy was the clear motivating factor, and not cases where women were assaulted or murdered for other reasons, and just happened to be pregnant at the time. While most of the cases here involve unmarried women, it's not because I've consciously excluded cases involving married women, it's because the nature of this type of violence usually targeted unmarried women. Each of these sources has their challenges and limitations, and they're all fairly different, but they do complement each other well. What I'm primarily interested in here are the narrative details around motive and MO, as well as the relationships of those involved, which tell us not only about what might have actually happened, actually in inverted commas, at least in terms of real cases, but also how these events were understood by contemporaries. In terms of historiography, historians such as Angus MacLaren, Linda Pollock, Carlos Spivak, Francis Dolan, Laura Gowing, and Mary Fazell, very, very recently, have all explored in varied degrees abortion in pre-industrial Britain. There's a general consensus that what we today would consider efforts at early abortion were at the time understood as attempts to relieve what were known as menstrual obstructions or to restore menses using herbal medicines. Evidence of these can be found in domestic remedy collections and in advertisements for female pills that address these ailments, all of which often came with a warning not to administer them to pregnant women. Common ingredients included rue, savin, pennyroyal, as well as saffron or bitter apple, all of which are known to have abortifacient properties. Although they were not necessarily reliable, they could work, and if taken in the right quantity, they could also be relatively safe. If these were taken prior to the quickening, which was when the mother first felt the movements of a fetus around 16 to 20 weeks, it was more likely understood to be a restoration of obstructed menses and not an abortion. And that's likely why Mrs. Williams told Anne that Jane had them upon her, because she was trying to pass off what she had put Jane through as a relieved menstrual obstruction and not a forced miscarriage, despite the fact that Jane was probably already quick with child because she had already started to lactate. Not all abortions were carried out using herbal remedies. Sarah Butler has explored what she refers to as abortion by assault in the medieval period, in which pregnant women were physically attacked with a specific intention of terminating pregnancies. Her research relates to a much earlier period than what I'm looking at, and the legal context was slightly different, so I'm not going to spend much time on that here. Jenny Hurrell-Eman also explores violence against pregnant women in early 18th century London, but her focus is on the ways in which women exercised agency by using the pregnant state to elicit more sympathy from the courts when they were the victims of violence. In these cases, women were not assaulted because they were pregnant, they just happened to be pregnant when they were assaulted. In my own research, I've considered cases where unmarried pregnant women were murdered by the fathers of their unborn children, some of which I'll be reconsidering here. In the cases I'm revisiting, the women were poisoned, but not using traditional remedies for menstrual obstructions, which I'm going to argue is significant. Finally, there's one other historian who has looked at cases of forced abortion, some of which I've also looked at, and that's Dana Rabin. She's examined 3 cases from the Northern Circuit of the English Assizes, and in her exploration of men's involvement in infanticide in the 18th century. She notes that some unmarried men who were unwilling or unable to fulfill their responsibilities as fathers could and did resort to equally extreme measures before an infant was born by encouraging or forcing their partners to ingest some sort of drug or poison to induce a miscarriage, which ultimately in these cases resulted in the mother's death. Robin argues that these men did this to restore patriarchal order. And I personally think this is a theoretical step too far. I don't think this has anything to do with restoring patriarchal order, and instead has everything to do with men who are already predisposed to coercive behaviors, who are responding to unplanned pregnancies in the worst way possible. And it's through drawing on modern social science research that this really becomes apparent. Now, historians are, of course, interested in continuity and change over time, and with the cases of forced abortion or violence against pregnant women, depending on how we choose to frame this, I think much of this is unfortunately one of continuity. Even today, in some parts of the world, homicide is the leading cause of death amongst pregnant women, and when that pregnancy is unplanned, that risk increases significantly. What did change over the period that I'm talking about here was legislation. Prior to Lord Ellenborough's Act in 1803, there was no specific secular legislation covering abortion. Most common law commentators, such as Coke, Hale, Blackstone, and Byrne, agree that giving a woman something to terminate a pregnancy after the quickening was a grave sin or misprison or misdemeanor, but it was not a felony because the fetus did not have legal personhood. It only became a felony if the pregnant woman died, in which case it was murder. Even the wording of the 1624 Infanticide Act specified women delivered of an issue of her body being born alive. And this is why Jane Jones's case, which I opened with, was unique because it was one of the few cases from this period where attempts were made to prosecute an abortion. So most of the cases from this period were brought to court because they resulted in the death or serious injury of the pregnant woman. She was the primary victim, not the fetus. After 1803, using any sort of poisons, medicines, or noxious substances to procure a miscarriage of a woman who was quick with child became a capital offense. Similar efforts that were used on women who were not quick with child were also criminalized for the first time, but they carried less severe penalties. The 1828 Offences Against the Person Act went even further by extending the terms of this to include instrumental abortions and by doing away with any distinction before or after the quickening, so both were capital offences. Legislation continued to change throughout the period, but I've chosen to end at 1830 for various reasons, including because I'm mainly a historian of the 18th century, but also because these legislative changes resulted in an increase in prosecutions of both forced and voluntary abortions. And the way many were presented, especially newspapers, makes it difficult to differentiate between forced or voluntary abortions. However, in the earlier cases where abortion was not a serious criminal offense, it's far easier to identify cases of coercion and violence against pregnant women. Now, I'm aware I've spent a lot of time setting this all up, but I think that context and background is important. I've looked at 24 cases of serious or fatal violence against pregnant women where the violence was unambiguously motivated by the woman being pregnant. I've separated these by MO, so those involving physical violence, those involving the administration of a known abortifacient, and those involving the administration of far more dangerous substances. It's not always possible to make such clear-cut distinctions, especially in cases where I've only been able to look at newspaper reports, but I do think that by sifting these cases in this way, when possible, patterns do emerge. In some cases, it's apparent that abortion was the intended outcome of violence or coercion. In other cases, the means used were so severe that the aggressors must have known their actions would result in the death of both pregnant women and fetus. All of these share similarities in that we see elements of seduction, coercion, deception, and violence throughout. The first category I'm going to discuss where pregnant women were physically assaulted in attempts to terminate their pregnancies. This is also the smallest category, with only two clear cases where the violence specifically targeted a pregnant woman's abdomen. So arguably without any intention of causing death, although there certainly was little regard for the women's welfare in these cases. In 1811, a 23-year-old man named John Gould was convicted at the Staffordshire Assizes and hanged for murdering his wife, who was pregnant with their second child. While the two were lying in bed, he rolled over on her and crushed her quite violently with his elbows in an effort to force her to miscarry the child. The papers attributed his actions to having been married too young before he had established the means to support a family. Although her injuries were fatal, she did live long enough to disclose what he had done to her, and that sealed his fate. This is the only case involving a married woman who died as a result of what was apparently a targeted attempt to force her to miscarry. The other case of an attempted abortion by assault is from the Chester Assizes in 1830, where a 20-year-old spinner named James Gleaves was indicted for wounding with intent to do grievous bodily harm and for procuring an abortion in a 16-year-old girl named Matilda, who became pregnant after he had seduced her. She was nearly full term, and he enticed her into a field and stabbed her in the stomach. She survived and initially attributed her injury to having sat on a pair of scissors, but according to the papers that reported this case, the truth eventually did come out, although it was not clear whether his intention was to murder her or to force her to miscarry. Given the fact that he only stabbed her stomach and he did not actually inflict a mortal wound, I'm inclined to think the fetus was the intended target, although the attempt was not successful because in her evidence, she discussed delivering the child 2 weeks after the attack, and the child was still living at the time of the trial 7 months later. He was found guilty on the final count of wounding with intent to induce an abortion, and he was hanged. These are the only 2 cases that I found where men were charged with using physical force against women, where the violence was targeted at the abdomen and thus possibly the fetus. There are many, many, many more cases where pregnant women were stabbed elsewhere on their bodies, strangled or drowned because they were pregnant. Some of these I've already written about in terms of a mortality penalty for unmarried women. In these cases, I've classed as femicide, so when women were murdered because they were women. In these cases, the violence was enacted by the father of the unborn child, but it was unequivocally directed towards the mother, to whom they were not married, with the intention of ending her life, which of course would result in the death of the fetus as well. So a single survivable stab to the stomach doesn't quite fit the pattern of other homicidal violence against unmarried pregnant women that I've looked at. I'm not trying to diminish the violence involved in these cases. I'm arguing that based on the MO involved, they were attempts at forced abortions. Earlier, I mentioned that one of the questions I'm grappling with is whether or not to consider some of these cases as forced abortion or just as straight up homicide or femicide. There are a couple of cases of physical violence in the sample that I think demonstrate why I'm questioning this. In these cases, the men were convicted of murdering women who they were not married to, who were pregnant with their children, and in both cases, the women were murdered after attempts at forced abortion had failed. In Yorkshire in 1775, a man named John Bolton was sentenced to hang for strangling his servant Elizabeth and burying her body in a shallow grave under his house. Newspaper reports indicate, and actually not just newspaper reports, I was at the National Archives today and looked at the depositions for this, so it's in there as well. So there's accounts that neighbors suspected she was pregnant by him and that he had previously tried to poison her to induce a miscarriage. And nearly 50 years later, in 1820, a Staffordshire man named Abel Hill was convicted of murdering Mary Martin and their 16-month-old son. Reports of this case state that he had previously given her something to abort their second child, which she was then pregnant with. And when this did not work, he lured her to a river, and when she arrived carrying the child, he drowned both of them. So in these cases, we can see an escalation of violence against pregnant women. When initial attempts to only kill the fetus failed, that violence escalated intentionally to end the pregnant woman's life. So in this, we can see that forced abortion and the murder of pregnant women by the father of the children exist on a spectrum of violence against women. Although violent, not all forced abortions were direct attempts on a woman's life. And at the same time, not all murders of pregnant women were forced abortions gone wrong. Both were motivated by an unplanned pregnancy, but differ in terms of who or what was targeted. And I think it's important to make this distinction, even if they're closely related and there's considerable gray area. What further emphasizes this distinction between forced abortion and femicide are cases of poisoning. And I've tried to roughly categorize these based on apparent MO. So methods that posed an undeniable risk to a pregnant woman's life and those which may have been less risky. And I think method in these cases helps shed light on the nature of the relationships involved and the attitudes of the male aggressors towards female victims. One of the key differences in method when it came to abortifacients are the types and quantities of substances administered. There are, of course, cases where women consume poison in an effort to induce an abortion of their own free will, which did sometimes result in accidental death, and I'm not considering those here. I'm only interested in cases where the narrative suggests that a woman was forced or coerced into consuming substances with the aim of terminating the pregnancy. We can find examples of this in literature. At the time, in Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria or the Wrongs of Women, published in 1798, the titular character described her experience as a 16-year-old servant whose master made repeated attempts to rape her. He finally succeeded and she ended up pregnant, and he gave her a vial of medicine to take, although he didn't tell her why. So she assumed it was poison intended to kill her, so she hid it away and didn't take it until she was in a desperate state, having been kicked out of the household because the master's wife walked in on him assaulting her, and the wife took the anger out on the servant. Maria finally took the substance thinking it would end her own misery, but instead it made her violently ill and miscarry. Although fictional, Wollstonecraft was describing a series of events that would have been familiar to countless women. In terms of the 24 cases I'm considering here, only 3 or 4 of them appear to have involved women being forced or coerced to consume a known abortifacient so herbs or medicines listed in medical texts and recipe collections that were used as remedies for menstrual blockages. Like many medicines, if given in excess, they could pose a risk to a woman's life, but if administered in smaller quantities, they are understood to be legitimate remedies, albeit with unpleasant side effects. Countless more women would have taken these substances either voluntarily or through force, but were never recorded because they just didn't end up in court. What I'm suggesting here is that in cases that did end up in court, serious harm towards the woman was not the intended outcome, although it was a clear risk. In these cases, these are therefore examples of forced abortion. And what we can also see in most of these cases is that the acts of coercion and violence used to induce abortion were not isolated instances, but the products of coercive and violent relationships. Jane Jones, whose story I opened with, is the only example of forced abortion that is an exception. She was forced by others to consume a controlled amount of a specific substance, which appeared to have been an adequate dose. The father of her child was not involved in this coercion. Although her experience was extremely painful and unpleasant, her life doesn't appear to have been in danger because she recovered relatively quickly because she was married a week later. The substance she was forced to take was intended to terminate her pregnancy and not end her life. The reason her case is an exception is because there's no reason to suspect that the sexual relationship that resulted in her pregnancy was anything other than consensual, and most, I argue here, were not. In a far more disturbing case from Worcestershire in 1830, a 14-year-old girl named Elizabeth was allegedly forced to take saffron pills intended to open her body. She was about 8 months pregnant as a result of her uncle raping her, and it was her uncle who had given her the pills. He initially gave her 3 pills, which she threw up shortly after taking. He waited a week and then forced her to take 3 more, which were also not effective. In her own deposition, Elizabeth said that a lodger in her uncle's house where she lived advised her not to take any more pills, or she might end up like a former servant in the household who had recently died. It does not appear that her uncle forced any more pills on Elizabeth, nor did he take any other measures to terminate the pregnancy, at least not that she discussed. Instead, he waited until she went into labor, forced her to deliver alone, and then allegedly took the child away, and she never saw it again. This case ended up in the assizes because Elizabeth charged her uncle with murdering her infant. He was acquitted. Although attempting to induce a late-term miscarriage would have been extremely dangerous, especially in such a young girl, and although her uncle had allegedly sexually abused Elizabeth, it doesn't appear that he wanted to kill her. So for these reasons, I think it's appropriate to categorize this one as an attempt at a forced abortion. Unlike Jane Jones's case, Elizabeth's uncle had abused her, so a history of coercion here is undeniable. The final case I'll discuss here involves a young man named Reuben Collins, who was convicted at the Essex Assizes in 1821 for giving Hannah Stammer's abortifacients. According to Hannah, Reuben had seduced her and promised to marry her, but when she became pregnant, he refused and instead compelled her to consume various substances, including pennyroyal pills. These did not have their intended effect, but they did make her extremely ill. Hannah's mother worked as an attendant at women's deliveries, so figured out what was going on, threw out the pills, and warned Reuben that if he had continued to force her to take them, Hannah could have died. He was alleged to have told her mother that he was aware of the danger and was glad she hadn't taken any more. According to him, Hannah had requested the pills, but Hannah disputed this. He was sentenced to 7 years transportation. In this case, it appears that the intention was to abort the fetus, not to kill Hannah, even though, had he carried on, he may very well have killed her. In this case, like others, what we see is a pattern of reproductive coercion that is accompanied by a degree of disregard for women's welfare. But the pregnant woman's death in these cases would have been collateral damage, for lack of a better term. Although I'm not trying to downplay these cases, I'm just trying to frame them in a particular way. Even though I think we can say these men likely did not intend to kill these women when they had impregnated and then poisoned, their intentions were not harmless. Other than Jane Jones, all of these men, who were the fathers of the unborn children, administered harmful poisons either by force or coercion. What's also important here, which I don't think much of the scholarship has articulated, even if it's implied, in many of these relationships, there is also evidence of an established pattern of coercion, deception, seduction, and in one case, rape. What the existing scholarship suggests is that cases like these are evidence of men who resorted to extreme measures because they did not want to take responsibility for the children they had fathered outside of wedlock. I'm not trying to dispute this because it certainly was the case. What I want to do is take this a step farther. Although a tragic response to illegitimacy, these cases are not the same as infanticidal mothers, where they kill their newborn children in the moments of desperation right after birth, because the cases of forced abortion here were premeditated. Also, and more importantly, most of these cases of forced abortion also have appear to have occurred within coercive sexual relationships with controlling and deceptive behaviors that preceded the unplanned pregnancy. So when men forced or compelled their sexual partners to consume toxic substances, it was often the conclusion of a series of coercive and harmful behaviors, and not just a desperate decision made simply in a state of fear or panic. Forced abortions did not occur in isolation. Modern social science research into reproductive coercion in places like the United States has demonstrated a clear link between forced abortion and patterns of intimate partner violence, which coercion is a feature of. In the modern context, it's argued that abortion clinics provide an ideal health-based setting for intimate partner violence interventions because of the connection between the two. Basically, forcing or coercing an intimate partner into taking harmful substances that causes them to miscarry tells us more about these relationships beyond the fact that these men did not want to take responsibility. Even if the intention was not to harm or to kill the pregnant women, these were acts of violence nonetheless, and are likely telling of the nature of the intimate relationships more generally. Many, if not most of these men also exhibited other coercive and violent behaviors towards the women they impregnated, when we can see compelling evidence of that in the common pattern of either seduction, followed by a refusal to marry, or men exploiting their positions of power to either seduce or rape female members of their households. So when we think about forced abortion in the past, we need to think of it beyond just the context of illegitimacy and see it as evidence of the violence and coercion these women likely experienced in the lead up to the pregnancies. So in short, when we apply what we know from modern context to the long 18th century, we can read forced abortion as evidence of violence and coercive relationships and not singular acts of desperation that occurred in isolation. So what about forced abortions that weren't really abortions? The final category I want to discuss are cases of fatal poisonings of pregnant women, which were understood to have been done with the intention of inducing abortion. But when we look at the details, I argue clearly were not. These are cases where substances like arsenic and mercury were administered to pregnant women, often by the father of the fetus, and were given in quantities that were obviously enough to kill an adult. My argument here is that these may present in some ways like forced abortions and were reported as such at the time, but in reality share far more similarities with premeditated murder than they do with abortion. These cases are related to instances of forced abortion in that they typically occurred within the context of these coercive relationships and the context of intimate partner violence, but were at the furthest extreme of the spectrum because they targeted the life of the pregnant woman, not just the fetus via the pregnant woman. These cases also far outnumber the others I've discussed, with at least 12 involving known poisons instead of abortifacient herbs or violence directed towards the womb. And the most obvious reason for this is because of the nature of the crimes. Poisoning someone with arsenic was far more likely to be fatal, so more likely to result in formal charges. And I'm not going to go over all of the details of the cases here because you simply don't have time. But these are cases that appear on the surface as attempts at abortion, and ultimately, I don't think were. So in Montgomeryshire in 1752, a married shoemaker named William Berwick was charged, along with a surgeon named Thomas Vaughan, with murdering William's servant Rachel, who was pregnant with his child. Witness statements indicate William had asked two male acquaintances if they could help him obtain something to help her miscarry. One of them went to a local apothecary and obtained a small amount of rue and savin, which they were told should do the business if she wasn't too far along. She was 7 months pregnant. William gave this to Rachel, but it did not have the desired effect. Thomas Vaughan deposed that William then asked for a purge, which he gave to William. Neither the contents of this medicine nor its intended purpose were stated, but it was undoubtedly intended for Rachel because, as I've already established, violent evacuations were understood to cause miscarriages. But that's not the worst of it. In the same transaction, William also purchased a penny's worth of yellow arsenic from Thomas so he could kill mice. He also most likely then mixed the arsenic into the purge and gave it to Rachel because very soon after taking it, she fell ill and died a few hours later. The surgeon who examined her body said her stomach showed signs of mortification, which is a common symptom of arsenic poisoning. William alleged it was the poison or the purge that Thomas Vaughan had given him that killed her, but Thomas stressed that William purchased both a purge and arsenic. And I think it highly unlikely that William would not have known that less than half a teaspoonful of arsenic would have been sufficient to kill Rachel. Neither William nor Thomas were formally indicted. The key here is that William had made past attempts at using known abortifacients, but when those didn't work, he escalated and forced her to consume a known poison. He obtained and administered the poison in strikingly similar ways to when we see arsenic used in cases of premeditated murder. A penny's worth of arsenic was acquired under the pretense of killing rats and was administered to the victim without their knowledge, resulting in their death. Arsenic was a murder weapon. It was not an abortifacient. Because of this, we should not see the use of arsenic on pregnant women as forced abortions. Arsenic, to my knowledge, was never listed as a treatment for blocked menses in any domestic recipe collection or any medical book. In extremely small quantities, it could be used in medicines, but these were drugs typically prepared by medical professionals. So for example, in 1786, Thomas Fowler published a book in which he discussed a diluted arsenic solution that he used to treat malaria. To my knowledge, arsenic wasn't a common ingredient in any domestic remedies. Please correct me if I'm wrong. It was used as a household poison for rodents. And when mentioned in domestic medicine books, it was discussed in terms of its toxicity, why to avoid it, and how to spot the symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Symptoms of arsenic poisoning include abdominal cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea, aka violent evacuations. And this is probably why William Berwick purchased a purge when Bruin's Haven failed. And there's some logic in that, but he then mixed in a fatal amount of arsenic, which to me indicates he either had an explicit desire to kill Rachel, or he was so concerned about the repercussions of her bearing his child that he was not worried about causing her fatal harm. You do not force someone to consume arsenic if you do not want to kill them. A death like this was not an accident. It was not an attempted abortion. It was murder. And we add this to the fact that William was in a position of authority and would have had no intention of marrying Rachel since he was already married. We can again view his actions as part of what was likely a persistent pattern of coercion and violence. So this is on that same spectrum of male violence that forced abortion sits on, but is at the furthest extreme. A man who ends a woman's life in this way was likely also violent, coercive, or manipulative with her well before her death. So this gives us a sense of what Rachel and countless other women like her likely endured before they were ever fed arsenic. And it's safe to speculate about this because of what modern research into reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence tells us. Violence like this is almost always a part of an escalating pattern carried out by men who believe they are entitled to treat women this way. Rachel's death is one of many similar cases. In 1823, in Radnorshire, a yeoman named Edward Griffiths was accused of poisoning his servant Sophia by mixing a fatal quantity of arsenic into her broth. She was pregnant with his child, and he had repeatedly tried to coerce her into swearing the child to someone else so he could avoid disgracing his family, and she refused to do this. And this is a pattern we see again and again. Like William Berwick, he purchased a penny's worth of arsenic, allegedly to treat mangy sheep, but then mixed it into her broth, which he was extremely careful to ensure no one else in the household consumed. She ate it, fell ill, miscarried, and died an excruciating death. And what makes Sophia's murder even more disturbing is that she was described as being a willing girl in terms of her work ethic, but weak of intellect. So she was vulnerable, and Edward allegedly was able to exploit that. Again, I'm confident Edward knew what would happen to Sophia by consuming arsenic, and I'm confident there must have been many more acts of violence and coercion in the lead up to her death. Moving away from Wales, in Yorkshire in 1774, John Scott was convicted of murdering Hannah Stocks, with whom he cohabited and had a young child. She was 5 or 6 months pregnant with their second child when he forced her to consume arsenic mixed with treacle from the tip of a knife. He had previously attempted to force her to take abortifacients such as bitter apple, which she refused. It was only when he threatened to stab her with that same knife that she took the poison off of it, knowing it would likely kill her. And we know this because she was able to explain this before dying. Again, here we see an escalation of coercion and violence culminating in the conscious decision to murder the woman when other attempts to rid the man of his quote-unquote problem failed. In a similar case from Preston in 1753, Isabella Waring was murdered by John Hodgson. She was pregnant with his child, and 2 weeks prior to her death, he visited a local woman to obtain medicine to induce a miscarriage, which didn't work. He then returned to the same woman to purchase a penny's worth of mercury under the guise of killing rats. He mixed it into some brown sugar and coerced Isabella into taking it. She died a horribly painful death, but was able to tell others about what happened to her, which secured a conviction. In discussing this case, Dana Rabin suggests that it's impossible to know whether John's intention was murder or miscarriage. And she's right in the sense that historians do have to be cautious when trying to deduce motive and intent in historical criminal records. However, to me, the MO suggests that this was premeditated murder because it reads like so many other cases of premeditated murder using the arsenic or mercury. Furthermore, 2 male witnesses deposed that they believed John had willfully poisoned Isabella by pretending to administer an abortifacient. So even some contemporaries understood this type of violence as premeditated murder first and foremost. We even see cases of unmarried fathers attempting to poison their young children who they no longer wanted to support. So for example, in Montgomeryshire in 1825, William Cadman was charged with attempting to murder his 2-year-old daughter and her mother, Elizabeth, by lacing cakes and cherries with what turned out to be sulfate of copper and arsenic. He had previously been paying maintenance for the girl, but then refused. So Elizabeth turned to parish officials for a filiation order. Following this, women went to see Elizabeth and brought the treats with him. Elizabeth thought both looked odd, so asked an apothecary to examine them, and he determined they were laced with poison, and William was subsequently convicted. William's intention here could only have been to kill both his daughter and her mother, and he attempted to do so with arsenic. Anytime a poison such as arsenic or mercury were administered, we can read these as murder and not attempted abortions. As with forced abortions, these were actions taken by violent and manipulative men who, for whatever reason, did not want to take responsibility for the children they fathered. Like forced abortions, the intimate relationships that ended in premeditated attempts on a woman's life were likely defined by other forms of coercion and violence, or at least deceit and manipulation demonstrated by repeated attempts to shirk responsibility and by administering less harmful abortifacients. Again, I think these tragic events not only tell us about the men's involvement in illegitimacy, they also tell us something about women's experiences of violence within relationships. And then the whole idea that men could and would murder women they impregnated was so prevalent that there's an entire genre of ballad about it. And these have been dubbed murdered sweetheart ballads, and they bear close resemblance to real cases where men killed their pregnant partners through overt acts of violence. The established trope is man seduces woman with promises of marriage, woman becomes pregnant and pursues man to marry her, but instead he murders her. Typically, these ballads end with some sort of justice where the man is held to account. And I think it's telling that in all but two of these ballads that are specifically about real cases, none of them mention attempts to terminate pregnancy. All of them just go straight to murder. The trope reflects the popular understanding that some men will do whatever it takes to seduce a woman and then do whatever it takes to avoid the consequences. The caution in these tales is that seduction can lead to murder. Seduction in these ballads is always presented as being manipulative and deceitful, where men never had any intention of marrying despite the initial promises. And if we apply a modern lens to this, I would argue that these also carry a cautionary tale about avoiding potentially abusive and coercive relationships altogether. A man who will lie to seduce you, such as in the Berkshire tragedy or the downfall of William Gosport and so on, or he uses his position of authority to coerce a woman, such as in the Dorsetshire tragedy, may also be the sort of man who will be violent towards you. And I'm including this very brief discussion of murdered sweetheart ballads here because I think they serve to demonstrate that some cases that were presented as forced abortions were actually murders, like the ones sung about in ballads. The way we can tell the difference between murder and forced abortion is because in murder weapons were used, like arsenic. And just as a side note, I'd like to suggest that because the relationships in these ballads were deceitful and never genuine, we should find a different name than sweetheart, because sweetheart is a bit saccharine and belies the coercion and harm that really defines them. So to conclude, unlike infanticide, which during this period was usually committed by women in an act of desperation immediately after birth, forced abortions were not one-off isolated instances carried out in an act of desperation. They were premeditated and part of a pattern of reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence, just like today. The most extreme end of this spectrum is femicide. And we see this manifest when pregnant women were forced to consume poisons like arsenic. Several studies in recent years have demonstrated that pregnant women in many parts of the world are more likely to die from homicide than from obstetric complications. When pregnant women are murdered, they're most often killed by their intimate partners. The motive for these are complicated, but are often associated with a desire to avoid responsibility, especially when pregnancies were unplanned. These homicides are often linked to patterns of intimate partner violence and other forms of coercion. Limiting women's access to safe and legal abortions put women at even greater risk of this type of violence. These cases from the late 18th century demonstrate how this violence often unfolds. Modern social science research into intimate partner violence helps historians understand the spectrum of men's violence towards women that includes reproductive coercion, forced abortion, and ultimately femicide. Most importantly, it helps us frame instances where men forced women to consume poison, such as arsenic, as murder and not attempted abortions. It also helps us consider the relationships that resulted in these pregnancies more closely. Illegitimacy was extremely common, especially towards the end of the 18th century, but it usually did not involve intimate partner violence. Many men did take responsibility, even if reluctantly, either by marrying the woman or by paying maintenance for the child. Many who chose not to take responsibility simply fled, which is neglectful but not violent. The men involved in the cases I've discussed here felt entitled to access these women's bodies for their own pleasure. They also felt entitled to force or coerce them into miscarrying, and failing that, some of them also felt entitled to end these women's lives. And as with today, these behaviors exist on a spectrum. What studying the historical context of cases like these helps us to understand is what is truly at stake when we do not support women's reproductive freedoms and don't take intimate partner violence seriously. Thank you.